Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome, everyone. And Stephen is going to introduce our guest today.
Rather than an introduction, because I think everybody who's joined us comes back repeatedly to hear Dale speak with us, I want to remind you that this is the concluding talk on Jewish art. But next month, on October 18 at 10 a.m., Dale's going to begin a new series on women and art at the St. Louis Art Museum. And that should be as fascinating, as in-depth, and as interesting as all her previous talks. We welcome you back, Dale, and thank you so much for doing this for us on a monthly basis and teaching us all so much and helping us to appreciate and understand the art in our own art museum. Welcome again, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, and good morning, everybody. Welcome back. I'm happy to see you all again and wish you all a belated and happy and sweet new year. I hope there's some nice surprises for everyone in the coming year. I honestly think that our presentation today will kind of knock your socks off. We plan to look at a selection of the astonishing number of Jewish artists at the St. Louis Art Museum's permanent collection. I kind of saved the best for last. There are scores of differences between these artists, stylistically and biographically, but all have a compelling story, and all are considered worthy of being represented by a museum such as ours, and all are Jewish. Throughout history, Jews have reacted to Judaism in different ways, sometimes quietly, sometimes in rebellion, sometimes shouting, and sometimes ignoring their Jewish heritage, like the little boy in this cartoon. As we look at Jewish artists in our museum, we'll see a bit of all of these reactions, and we'll see that Jews throughout the world have been key contributors to the arts. One of the earliest works of Jewish art lay in God's command to Bezalel. Being that he was the Jewish artisan appointed specifically by God to build the tabernacle, Bezalel might be called the first Jewish artist. But there are many, many more. You really won't believe the number of Jewish artists in SLAM's permanent collection. Now, most are names that you'll be familiar with. Some may be new to you, but they're all artists that have made their mark in the art world, and all are considered to be some of the very, very best. These are photos of just some of the Jewish artists exhibited at SLAM. Helen Frankenthaler over here, I think she looks like she might have been in my high school graduating class at U City. Richard Serra down here looks like the spitting image of his sculptures, tough as steel. Pizarro up here kind of reminds me of Moses. And Bruce Nauman down here looks like he's wearing a hat that might have been owned by Wyatt Earp. Ron Arad next to him looks like a hoot. And Modigliani up here, he looks like a movie star. Their personalities seem totally different. Some appear to be welcoming, full of charisma and charm, and others off-putting and disagreeable. Their art is as dissimilar and distinct as their temperament. Each has their own unique style. One would never confuse a Mark Rothko painting with a Roy Lichtenstein painting. Yet there's one thing, other than their creativity and their talent, that they all have in common. Each of these artists was born into a Jewish family. Yet many of the people whose work is on view refuse to define their art as Jewish. Indeed, for artists whose families came to America in the early 20th century, cultural assimilation rather than maintaining a minority identity may have been their goal. Some felt that to think of their work as simply Jewish was limiting. And we know that at various points in history, being identified as Jewish might also have had a negative effect on their career. Now, the appearance of Jewish artists in painting and sculpture is more or less a modern phenomenon. Beginning in the 19th century, more and more Jews were found in these fields, often in the avant-garde. Some created specifically religious art, but most that we will look at today did not. Their work was more about the art than about religion. Working in diverse styles, they adopted both figuration and abstraction across a varied media. Some artists addressed Jewishness, while others made art indistinguishable from that of their Gentile counterparts. While expressing their Jewishness or not, these artists represent a power team whose works have long been admired and acclaimed. So hold on to your hat as we delve into some of the Jewish artists at Slam. The oldest piece in our museum made by a Jewish artist is this coffee pot by Meyer Myers. This coffee pot is as good as it gets in American silver. Meyer Myers is considered a master, a Dutch immigrant who became the first Jewish silversmith in New York, and even became president of the Silversmiths Guild. He produced many secular pieces, such as this coffee pot, as well as liturgical elements for churches and synagogues, such as alms basins and baptismal bowls. He's probably most known for the ornamentation of the Torah scrolls he crafted for the first Jewish synagogue in the New World, the Touro Synagogue in Rhode Island, which he helped found. During the Revolution, he moved to Connecticut with other members of his congregation, when it was common for entire congregations to flee from the British. Like Paul Revere, he was a patriot, active in the cause of independence, melting lead items into bullets for his army. His mark is a double stamping of his last name, overlapping the S in Myers. In late 19th century France, only one Jewish artist maintained a pivotal position in the vanguard of his time. This distinction belongs to Camille Pissarro, who was one of the principal figures in the founding, development, and dissemination of Impressionism. Camille Pissarro could be called the godfather of the Impressionist movement. He was the oldest of this group of rebels and the mediator between their unique personalities. His influence is probably still underestimated. He was kind and talented and Jewish. Though of Jewish lineage, no references to his ancestry can be found in his paintings. There is no trace of Judaism in his work, and he claims to have been alienated from his family's traditions. Nevertheless, the fact that he was born a Jew had an influence on the man and on the course of his life. As a young man, Camille Pissarro famously advised that the best way to advance French art would be to burn down the Louvre, thus eradicating the influence of the art of the past. But by the end of his career, his views had mellowed, and he produced a series of several views of the Louvre in different light and weather conditions, such as our painting on the right. It is rendered in purely impressionistic manner, with broken brushstrokes, pastel colors, in a sunlit scene. He was a primary developer of the Impressionist technique. This painting of the bell tower is one of 40 that he painted of this area, also in this Impressionistic style. Throughout his life, in varying degrees, the, quote, Jewish problem would manifest itself in different ways. At times, it would be connected to his relations with his immediate family. Pissarro grew up in a tiny, tight-knit Jewish community on the island of St. Thomas. His mother married a man several years younger who was her nephew by marriage. The marriage, therefore, was not sanctioned by the Jewish authorities, and Camille was considered illegitimate. The ensuing scandal was of huge proportions, at least in local terms. It would have been a humiliating experience, and the stigma probably remained for Camille. And his mother's family would not even speak to her. In a twist of irony, the same thing occurred when Camille married Julie, their maid, who wasn't Jewish, and his mother wouldn't speak to them either. As a Jew, Pizarro felt menaced by the passions that surfaced during the tumult over the Dreyfus affair. And this was a big deal for 10 years in France and divided many relationships. To refresh your memory, the Dreyfus affair involved a Jewish artillery captain in the French army, Alfred Dreyfus, who was falsely convicted of passing military secrets to the Germans. In 1894, after a French spy at the German embassy in Paris discovered a ripped up letter in a wastebasket with handwriting said to resemble that of Dreyfus, he was court-martialed, found guilty of treason, and sentenced to life behind bars. In a public ceremony in Paris following his conviction, Dreyfus had the insignia torn from his uniform, his sword broken, and was paraded before a crowd that shouted, "Death to Judas, death to the Jew." Pizarro's sense of justice was outraged. He believed in Dreyfus's innocence. He was distressed by the anti-Semitic violence. On a personal level, the Dreyfus affair took its toll on Pizarro. Degas, one of his best friends, became a savage anti-Semite. He blamed the Jews for all of France's troubles. After anti-Semitic incidents, both Degas and Renoir both shunned Pizarro. And he wonders in a letter, what can be taking place in the minds of such intelligent men that leads them to become so stupid? What does all this mean? Well, very little in regard to Pizarro's painting, which appears not to have been affected in any significant way. It does, however, give us a better understanding of a Jewish artist's dilemma in the late 19th century France. Though of Jewish origin, Pizarro succeeded in entering the mainstream of Parisian avant-garde, and he desired to be judged solely by universal art standards. Following Pizarro's example, an important group of artists were able to surmount the prejudice related to their Jewish roots and move into the forefront of the modern art movement. They were part of what is called the School of Paris. In the early years of the 20th century, Paris became a magnet for artists from all over the world and the focus of the principal innovations of modern art. The term School of Paris grew up to describe this phenomenon. The twin chiefs of the movement were Picasso and Matisse. But in addition, Jewish artists were part of the circle: Chagall, Lipschitz, Modigliani, and Soutine. We've already talked about Chagall in earlier presentations, so let's look at the other three. Lithuanian and Jewish, the refugee artist Jacques Lipschitz arrived in Paris at precisely the right time, when the early 20th century European avant-garde was shaking up the art world and Cubism was born. Lipschitz's style was Cubism translated into 3-dimension. Later, his work often incorporated themes from Judaism. Lipschitz may be regarded as one of the foremost contributors to the Cubist style and to modern sculpture. Jacques Lipschitz was born Chaim Jacob Lipschitz to a Jewish family in a small town in the former Russian Empire, modern-day Lithuania. It was thanks to his mother's encouragement that the young Lipschitz at age 17 gave up engineering and moved to Paris in 1908. Although his father was disappointed, Lipschitz later said that after I went to Paris, my father forgave me, and as long as he was able to, he contributed to my support. In Paris, Lipschitz adopted the French first name Jacques and soon made contact with members of some of the avant-garde artist groups of the period, which were flourishing in Paris. The artist sculpted this work soon after meeting Pablo Picasso in 1913. The shifting facets and geometric forms form the sailor's figure and recall the compositional approach of Picasso's Cubism. When the Germans occupied Paris in 1940, he fled to New York City. In his later years, Lipschitz became more involved in his Jewish faith, even referring to himself as a religious Jew in an interview in 1970. He began abstaining from work on Shabbat and prayed daily. Lipschitz claimed that he often derived inspiration from his Jewish background and from the Bible. When asked if he identified as a Jew, he responded, "I am a Jew, and I am a believer, and I always was. Amedeo Modigliani had a habit of introducing himself as, "My name is Modigliani and I am a Jew." And what a Jew he was. Born into one of Livorno's most prominent Sephardic Jewish families, Modigliani was bound for prominence. He had a tolerant upbringing in Italy and was fluent in French thanks to his French mother, who grew up in Marseille. This allowed the artist to blend in with the French culture and move between social spaces with greater ease than some of his fellow Jewish artists who really could only speak Yiddish. His mother was descended from a long line of Talmudic scholars and intellectuals. His father was a successful entrepreneur until, that is, the family's lucky streak ended. As a child, Modigliani suffered from pleurisy and typhoid fever, and he never fully did regain his health. Amedeo Modigliani's adult life was straight out of a Harlequin romance. Late in 1919, in a squalid Paris studio strewn with wine bottles, Amedeo Modigliani painted a wistful portrait of his 21-year-old lover. A few months later, the impoverished artist died of tubercular meningitis at age 35. The following evening, his mistress, 8 months pregnant with their second child, leapt to her death from a fifth-story window. The legend of his troubled life and early death and the subsequent suicide of his young fiancée has tended to overshadow his significant artistic achievements. The life of Modigliani so often resembles a legend, it's kind of difficult to determine fact from fiction. What remains of this extraordinary man is a body of work that modernized figurative painting. He was your typical romantic genius, handsome, poor, proud, amorous, drunk, ill, and he died an early death. If Van Gogh is the quintessential mad genius, Modigliani is the quintessential bohemian alcoholic. He really was a dashing, drug-using, womanizing wastrel. Some people nearly swooned at his suave, cultivated manner, while others found him an unbearable buffoon. He always wore a bright silk scarf knotted around his neck, and he believed that artistic talent was no excuse for not dressing nicely. Modigliani's art doesn't fit into the standard art historical categories like expressionism or cubism, and there was essentially no reference to Judaism in his work. To be so exclusively focused on portraiture was unusual, if not unique, in its time. Of course, it is Modigliani's stylized interpretations of kind of languid, melancholy women that he's best known for today. Often characterized by their elongated bodies and blank eyes, his subjects are distinctly Modigliani. The woman in this painting was one of Modigliani's favorite models, a young worker known only by her first name, Elvira. He painted this portrait the year before his death. This was the painting that was donated to SLAM by Joseph Pulitzer that we talked about in an earlier presentation. Pulitzer said that his son titled it, "The Little Girl Who Wouldn't Eat Her Spinach." I suppose she does have that sort of petulant body language. A critic said that nonchalance is her uniform. During Modigliani's short and difficult life, the going rate for his paintings was less than $10, and takers were few. Last November, an anonymous bidder at a Sotheby's auction house in New York City paid $31.3 million for a Modigliani portrait. The public always loved Modigliani's work, its elegance, its refinement, its panache. After all, his name was Modigliani, and he was a Jew. Chaim Soutine was born and raised in a shtetl in a small Jewish settlement near Minsk in what is present-day Belarus. The 10th of 11 children, his father was a tailor, and Soutine was raised under extremely modest means. His upbringing was fairly typical of Russian-born Jews during this era, living under a hostile government. Soutine's interest in drawing incurred opposition within his Orthodox family, and the small Jewish community that he lived in because of Talmudic prescriptions regarding images. According to an oft-recounted story, the young Sutin was beaten in punishment after presenting a portrait to a rabbi. The suffering he experienced within the Jewish ghetto of his youth is believed to have influenced his later canvases. In 1915, after making his way to Paris, Lipschitz, Modigliani, and Sutin became fast friends. He was known to sing a Jewish melody, and Yiddish was his best language, as well as those in his other circle of friends. At the same time, there was no connection between his Jewish background and his art at all, yet he didn't change his name. Now, food in particular was a constant theme in his work, which I think perhaps might have stemmed from its central role in Jewish ritual. Sutin is known for his still lifes, especially his meat pictures. He brought the subjects from slaughterhouses and held on to them for so long that, according to a frequently told tale, their rotting stench drove his neighbors to call the police. He pleaded artistic necessity, and well, you gotta love the French, they managed to compromise by agreeing to abate the smell with formaldehyde. Sutin was prone to bouts of depression, and when his girlfriend was sent to a Nazi camp in 1940, he was pushed over the edge. He attempted suicide. With the Nazi invasion of Paris in the summer of 1940, Sutin was eventually forced to flee his apartment in Paris for fear of being captured by the Gestapo. The years that followed were Sutin's darkest, as he was forced from a safe house in Paris to villages in the Loire Valley, moving from place to place with forged passports. Sutin fled for his life, often sleeping in forests in the rain. The stress of living like a hunted man aggravated Sutin's ulcer. He was rushed to a hospital, but his condition required emergency surgery. And 2 weeks before the French liberation in 1944, he died due to complications from that surgery. Sutin is considered one of the 20th century premier Jewish artists, though none of his work explicitly addresses Jewish themes. His story of emigration, assimilation, and destruction outlines the tragedy of so much of 20th century European Jewish life. Events during World War II influenced many artists, especially Jewish artists. Although they were deeply affected by the events of the Holocaust and were elated by the establishment of the Jewish state in 1948, for the most part, their sentiments found little direct expression in their art. It's become increasingly difficult to establish whether a particular artist was a Jew or not. Many Jews changed their names altogether, and the subject matter gave no clue, as most were abstract or surrealist works. After the war, the Jewish artist had become almost indistinguishable from his counterparts. And yet some artists' paintings, as might have been expected, were filled with condemnation of Nazism, like Ben Shahn. Shahn was born in Lithuania in the Pale of Settlement. His parents were Orthodox Jews who fled the poverty and anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe. His father was a political activist whom the Tsar's forces arrested, imprisoned, and sent to Siberia. In 1906, when Shahn was 8 years old, his family immigrated to New York, where they were reunited with Shahn's father. As Shahn reached adulthood, anti-Semitic fascists rose to power in Europe. His paintings during the war were filled with anti-Nazi imagery. After the war, he continued his artistic advocacy of social causes. This painting is an example of that focus. A crumbling environment and a figure with one leg convey the wreckage of war, in this case, World War II. The space within the ruined building remains unresolved, as does the destination of the man on the red stairs. The stairway leads nowhere. It's a visual suggestion of the senselessness of war. Immigrant artists generally make careful choices about how to define and represent their identities and ideologies in their art, but Shahn was pretty outspoken. Later, during McCarthyism, he was blackballed for a time for being a leftist and CBS refused to use his art due to political pressure. Much of Sean's later artistic work retained elements of his Jewish background: windows for a temple in Buffalo, illustrations for a Passover prayer book, a series of watercolors on the Dreyfus Affair, frequent appearance of stylized Hebrew lettering in his painting. His art, though, was highly critical of American life, often depicting American poverty and injustice. His work was inexorably tied to his pursuit of social justice and lifelong activism within leftist political beliefs. He continually used his considerable and multifaceted skills on behalf of the poor and on behalf of the oppressed. After World War II, the focus of the artist changed, and viewers began to have trouble. Where was the vase of flowers or the majestic landscape that they were used to seeing? Now abstraction became the core, the concept, and the focus was about marks on canvas, about color, shape, texture, form, and line. Simplified. The camera was there to accurately record the world around them. The artist was there to interpret and innovate. Mark Rothko was born Mark Rothkowitz in Latvia, the fourth child of an Orthodox Jewish family. His parents spoke Russian, while the children were taught in Yiddish and Hebrew. Mark spent 7 years in the Cheder before his family moved to America. He studied Jewish texts for long hours every day. Under the increasing pressure of the Tsarist pogroms, the family emigrated to the United States in 1913. Mark said that he had a strict religious upbringing, even in America. He delivered newspapers and waited tables to pay for his education. He had a scholarship to Yale, but dropped out due to anti-Semitism there. He worked with the WPA and he changed his name. In New York, Rothko moved in primarily Jewish intellectual circles, a fact crucial to understanding his art. For all of the vehemence of Rothko's repudiation of Jewish influences in his art, that influence might be said to be found in his non-objective fields of color. Some feel they are deeply Jewish. Now, this is strictly an interpretation never described by Rothko, but by critics and art historians. Many critics say that the composition of Rothko's large canvases with blocks of colors represent a modern day page from the Torah. Imagine a printed page of the Torah. The biblical text in one block occupies perhaps a third of the page and would, considering its primacy, be printed in bold and large lettering. Other texts, those of classical commentaries on the Bible, appear in other rectangular blocks of space written in small letters. Rothko's style copies this basic design. However, he replaces the blocks of texts with blocks of color. Now, many have interpreted his paintings in this fashion. There is logic to it, even though Rothko never talked about his work in this way at all. By 1958, Rothko was famous and wealthy. He even visited the Kennedys at the White House. Sadly, Rothko suffered from depression, and as it deepened in the late 1950s, the brilliant colors of his paintings began to darken, and he became really depressed. By 1964, dark colors dominate, and by 1970, the year he committed suicide, light had vanished from his paintings. Critics have described his works as tasteful paintings about nothing. However, I think standing in front of a Rothko is an emotional confrontation. Do me a favor, give yourself some time and just stand in front of a Rothko painting for a while and see how it affects you. I know it affects me. Rothko thought art could change the world. He did not want decoration for the rich, but wanted people to weep. He called these paintings pockets of silence, a gateway or a portal, a space representing where we came from and where we will end up. In a way, they are about Judaism, about now and forever. Franz Klein was born and raised in Pennsylvania in a small coal mining community that offered few opportunities for artistic development. Although Jewish, his family was non-observant. His father, a saloon keeper, committed suicide in 1917 when Klein was only 7 years old. His mother later remarried and sent her son to an institution for fatherless boys, which the artist referred to as the orphanage. Determined to make his own way, Klein worked as a cartoonist for his high school newspaper and managed to escape to his small town to attend art school. And then he studied in England, where he met his future wife, a former ballet dancer who was working as an artist model at his school. She unfortunately dealt with depression and eventually was institutionalized. New York proved difficult for Klein. He was forced to take odd jobs, painted murals in bars, and sold illustrations to magazines. But Klein eventually worked out a painting style of broad black brushstrokes on a white background. These energetic lines were made with house paint and were not at all spontaneous, even though they look it. He used an overhead projector, enlarging sketches that he had made on the only paper that was available to him, telephone book white pages. Klein was dubbed the black and white artist. The pattern looks like calligraphy, but it's not. These paintings are well thought out, reworked and reworked and reworked until Klein was satisfied. In this painting, the title Bethlehem in the angular forms may recall the iron girders or wooden beams of an industrial structure like Bethlehem steel. Or they might remind you of a crucifix. But in reality, Klein named many of his abstract paintings, including Bethlehem, after Pennsylvania towns and counties. Some also believe that the artist's obsession with black was connected to his childhood spent in a coal mining community dominated by heavy industry. Klein was a likable, legendary talker, a heavy drinker, but not an ugly drunk. They say he was a melancholy loner, but with the wit and grace of Fred Astaire. He became famous in the 50s, but not for long. He fell ill and died in 1962 in New York of heart failure at the age of 51. Born in Russia, Louise Nevelson's big break came at age 60, when her monochrome found wood constructions were included in a show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1959. That show was also the launching pad for Jasper Johns, Elizabeth Kelly, Robert Rauschenberg, and Frank Stella, all who were younger than Nevelson's son. By the time she died in 1988, at 88 years old, she was a bona fide cultural legend. In her flamboyant heyday, Nevelson's thick false eyelashes, which I think look like tiny mink stoles, and her dramatic way with the headscarf were as emblematic of the New York art scene as Andy Warhol's white wig. In 1985, she appeared at the White House to receive a National Medal of Arts from President Ronald Reagan. She was photographed for the cover of Life magazine, and she was the subject of a set of Louise Nevelson commemorative stamps issued in 2000 by the US Postal Service. She was a celebrity and lived what we might call a bohemian existence, having many affairs with famous men. Louise Nevelson was born Leah Berlyovsky in Kiev, Ukraine. Her name was changed to Louise when her family came to the United States after fleeing the abuse aimed at the Jewish communities there. Her father, who owned a thriving lumber business, brought the family to Rockport, Maine in 1905 and successfully established the same business. The family was Orthodox and spoke Yiddish at home and didn't fully acclimate into the community. In 1920, she accepted a proposal of marriage to a wealthy businessman and lived on Central Park West in New York. 2 years later, Louise gave birth to their son, Myron. Nevelson never adapted to life as a housewife. Finally, she realized that to become a serious artist, she had to abdicate her roles as wife and mother. In 1931, she left her husband, placed her son in her parents' care, and headed for Munich, Germany to study painting. She always remembered that on her way to class each day, she passed the home of Adolf Hitler. Upon her return to the States, Nevelson settled in New York City, established a studio, and began her routine of foraging for wooden remnants, boards of all proportions and qualities, turned wood that had served as legs of tables, desks, and beds, carved pieces, curved arms of chairs, even toilet seats. She would then build a series of shallow boxes of the same size, and in each box, she would arrange and rearrange a group of remnants until she was satisfied with the composition. When all the boxes for the sculpture were completed, Nevelson painted them all black, white, or gold. Because the disparate elements have all been unified with one single paint color, New Continent reads simultaneously as many small works and one monumental sculpture. She calls these works sculptured walls. Nevelson was notably reticent on the subject of her Jewish heritage. When questioned in interviews on the topic, she replied that it was too personal to discuss. Yet despite her cultural and ancestral ambivalence, Nevelson devoted several pieces to memorializing the Holocaust. Now, Nevelson lived near poverty until her middle years, yet she left an estate of $100 million upon her death with works in many of the world's major museums. She was highly publicized as an eccentric, flamboyant, and sexually liberated woman who became an inspiring force in the feminist art movement. Yet she described herself as not a feminist. She said, "I'm an artist who happens to be a woman." David Smith might not be a household name like Picasso, but he is more or less the quintessential 20th century American sculpture. Imagine Jackson Pollock, but with a welding torch. Smith was a pioneer of welded metal sculpture. He helped reinvent how artists create three-dimensional works, crafting geometric abstractions that has much to do with painting and collage as they did to sculpture. In as much as one can, Smith approached sculpture the way abstract expressionists approached painting. He played on impulse and intuition. Left-leaning politics, the labor movement, and the experiences gained in a rapidly industrializing America all shaped his work and worldview. Smith also had that particular aura of the heroic outsider. Again, think Jackson Pollock. Smith grew up in Indiana, the son of an engineer, and from an early age was enthralled by trains and railroads. When he was 19, he worked as a welder and riveter in a Studebaker car factory. When's the last time you heard that name? Anyway, Smith believed that artists should embrace industrial materials and techniques. Judaism played no role in his work. His most famous work is probably his Cubi series. These large metal sculptures became one of his most expensive works of contemporary sculpture ever sold at auction, selling for $23.8 million at Sotheby's. Our sculpture is one of that series. His pieces have a dynamic quality that changes with the light of day. They are not heavy, although they look like they should be. He's been called a steelyard maverick, a Paul Bunyan figure with welding tools strapped to his back, an embattled hero. He lived fast and died young in an auto accident in 1965. Barnett Newman was a New York native whose parents had emigrated from Poland in 1900. Barnett's father was a passionate Zionist and supporter of the National Hebrew School of the Bronx. As well as attending Hebrew school, Barnett and his brothers and sisters were educated at home by Jewish scholars from Europe. A classic Barnett Newman painting has a vertical line, or zip, as he himself called them, dividing a field of color. The zip defines the picture plane, separates the composition, yet kind of binds it together. Newman rarely missed an opportunity to call attention to his Jewish ancestry, unlike others who resisted Jewish interpretations of their work. He proudly claimed that his first zip painting, titled One Mint, was an abbreviated version of the word atonement. Among his other works inspired by Jewish ideas are Genesis, Primordial Light, and Day One. Although Newman's paintings appear to be purely abstract, the titles hinted a Jewish theme. For example, one is called Adam and Eve, and another Abraham, the name of the biblical patriarch as well as his father. Newman also loved the number 18, Baha'i, and used 18-inch modules in all of his works. Barnett Newman was a kibitzer, a joker, a storyteller. He once ran for mayor of New York City, advocating a civic arts program. They say that if you met him on the street, you would be in for a 6-hour conversation. In the early 1900s, Philip Guston, or Philip Goldstein as he was born, his family immigrated to Los Angeles, which was then home to the largest Jewish population west of Chicago. Guston and his 7 brothers and sisters grew up impoverished in a kosher home and attended religious school. Guston's father could not attain a position in his trade and was forced to work as a junkman. His failures led to his suicide. It was a 10-year-old Philip, the youngest of 7, who discovered his father's body hanging in a shed. Ropes and knots entered Guston's work throughout his career. In 1932, Guston's beloved brother Nat died from injuries sustained in a car accident. Dislocation and tragedy were there from the start. A closet in the crowded living space, illuminated by a single bare light bulb, became Guston's sanctuary. There he made comic drawings. Guston, like so many other immigrants of his time, loved comic strips, an art that proliferated at the turn of the century. It was rooted in caricature, a form dependent on reducing human beings to easily discernible types. Guston's early work is figurative, such as martial memory that you see here. Ultimately, the fervor and commitment of the abstract expressionists with whom he associated, as well as the excitement of their art, captivated Guston. And in the post-war years, he produced abstract work such as the next 2 paintings that you see here, these 2. Guston taught at the art school at Washington U until 1947. In later years, Guston totally changed his style. Critics were dumbfounded and many of them angry. His new style of painting was a mix of absurd and comic realism, such as the painting on the bottom right here. Guston filled his paintings with crudely painted objects and people, and the symbolism and allegories are puzzling and cryptic and hard to understand. We have about half a dozen or more works by Philip Guston in our collection, and these paintings are examples of his development in distinctive styles. Richard Serra has been dubbed Man of Steel. He emerged out of a radical art scene in the 1960s and went on to become one of America's most controversial artists, even provoking some New Yorkers to threaten him with death. He once sued the American government when a public work of his was removed from its site, and the New York government destroyed it. Richard Serra's reputation precedes him. He's cerebral, single-minded, austere, and steely and uncompromising as his work. His towering curves and sheets of oxidized steel are now an artistic signature as instantly recognizable as Pollock's splatters of paint. Serra's father was Spanish from Majorca. He had immigrated to America and married a Russian Jewish girl, and they had settled in San Francisco, where Serra was born in 1939. While struggling to create a piece of sculpture for a synagogue in Germany, Serra recalls that at age 5, he asked his mother, "What are we? Who are we? Where are we from?" One day she answered, "If I tell you, you must promise never to tell anyone, never. We are Jewish." Serra comments, "I was raised in fear, in deceit, in embarrassment, in denial. I was told not to admit who I was or what I was. I saw Sarah at a symposium in person with Ellsworth Kelly about 20 years ago, and he was just like his sculptures, aggressive and controversial with that New York smug attitude. He sat with his turtleneck sweater and his cowboy boots and jeans with one arm draped over his chair. Sarah was dauntingly articulate, a buff, powerful-looking man with a large head, a fringe of close-cropped gray hair, and black eyes whose intense stare reminds you of Picasso. A real Sarah process, I thought, physical, aggressive, almost daring anyone to question his responses. Sarah's large creations use sheets of steel. The thick, high steel walls are fortress-like. He kept his huge minimalist sculptures primarily in towns and parks, where rather than complementing their setting, they opposed them with hard right-angled steel forms among natural, soft, twisting trees. They kind of jolt you awake. The piece on the left is embedded into the road between the St. Louis Art Museum and Art Hill. The large circular sculpture is barely apparent at street level. The work is comprised of two identical steel semicircular components, one upright and the other on its side. Sarah meant for viewers to walk and drive over the work and through this process to become more aware of the street itself and the sculpture's relation to it. Sarah began the work on the right by mixing latex rubber with Liquitex paint. Using a corrugated metal door as a mold, he poured the mixture over it and let the rubber set. He created 3 separate casts using this method, displaying them as overlapping mats laid directly on the gallery floor, as you see on the right. The work was initially bright orange with sharp peaks and valleys, but the color is fading. Just about every major museum in the world now owns at least one Sarah sculpture. The art historian Robert Hughes called him not only the best sculptor alive, but the only great one at work anywhere in the 21st century. There's something about Ron Arad which is weirdly reminiscent of Paddington Bear. Maybe it's the hat and scarf that he always seems to be wearing along with his baggy clothes. Arad settled in Britain after being brought up by Bohemian parents in Israel. There's no chance of me ever becoming English, he says. You don't become what you are not. Although most of his work was created out of Israel, Arad said that growing up in Israel influenced his work. I grew up in Tel Aviv, and that's where I learned about the world and about art. Arad brings an impish sense of humor and quirkiness to his work. Is one of the most influential designers in the world. Just look at the title of this chair from our collection, At Your Own Risk Chair. He's known for his minimalist style and his experimental use of steel sheet. Among Ron Arad's most significant furniture designs is a group of welded steel furniture treated as sculpture. It only becomes a chair when you sit on it, and then it is at your own risk. Ron Arad is one of the most well-known Israelis on the global art scene, and his work covers a huge range of disciplines, from architecture to furniture, from landmark buildings to housewares, sunglasses, as well as jewelry. He stands out among the most influential designers of our time for his daredevil approach to form, structure, technology, and materials. Arad designed the UK Holocaust Memorial, the foyer of the Tel Aviv Opera House, and his first full architectural design, the Holon Museum of Design on the right. It's not too far from Tel Aviv, and it is absolutely incredible. I mean, look at this design. That's a building. It's just amazing. There are so many more Jewish artists at SLAM, and all have a tale to tell. Each of these artists has been, if not a trailblazer, at least a force to reckon with in the story of art. And it was really difficult to choose which artists to highlight, but knowing that we have a time constraint, let's look briefly at a few more. Here's an artist that you may not have heard of, Ellie Nadelman. He embraced the classical mode, and it made him an innovator in early 20th century sculpture because most were interested in abstraction. Born in Warsaw to a middle-class Jewish family, Nadelman blended classical subjects with modern techniques and abstract forms. Nadelman drew on ancient Greek sculpture as his inspiration for his work, such as early ideal head. Beauty magnet and art collector Helena Rubinstein purchased 10 examples from Nadelman, citing them as emblems of perfect beauty with which she wanted her products associated. Adolf Gottlieb, in 1935, a number of American artists joined together in a group called the 10, which was soon absorbed into a larger circle of abstract expressionism. All of the members of the 10 were Jewish, along with a few critics and journalists. Gottlieb was part of the group. Throughout the 40s, his signature style was the pictograph. He divided each canvas into boxes and painted a simple form into each box like you see here. The forms appeared to be telling a story, but even Gottlieb didn't know what they meant. While Gottlieb stated his personal identity as Jewish, it mostly didn't play a role in his paintings. He did, however, create a Torah curtain for a synagogue that utilized this pictographic style to interpret religious symbols. Stephen Green is an important figurative mid-century artist. We have 3 powerful paintings of his from that time. He was born Saul Goldstein, an observant Jew from Poland. Green taught at Wash U in the 40s when he began his series of passion paintings. The deposition depicts Christ being removed from the cross. It was purchased by Joseph Pulitzer and given to Slam. The letters go nowhere, the figures do not interact with each other, and their expression suggests that each is caught up in his or her own moment of detached emotion. It's hopeless and helpless, even with the bright palette. His work from that time was flat and depressed and anguished. He liked to kind of crowd things. After the mid-50s and until his death, Green's mature work was much more abstract and less figurative. Stephen Green's work is virtually unknown today, but it was not always so. In 1950, in 2 spreads, Life magazine featured Green as one of the best artists in the United States under the age of 36, citing him as a highly successful painter whose work was bought up quickly by important museums and collectors. But Green never received this degree of attention and accolade ever again in his career. He always looked back to that time in St. Louis when he was a hot young artist. Eva Hess was born into a family of observant Jews in Hamburg, Germany in 1936. When Hess was 2 years old, her parents sent her and her older sister to the Netherlands to escape Nazi Germany. In 1938, the family fled and settled in New York City. Hess went on to create works of art with such materials as latex, fiberglass, and polyethylene, wire, and plaster. She used repetitive forms, circles, and squares. It's interesting that the workshop that Hess used was staffed by men who were all Holocaust survivors. There are no photos of her aging because she died of cancer at age 34. Although her career was brief and her life tragic, her work is memorable and continues to influence the work of contemporary artists. Helen Frankenthaler grew up on Manhattan's Upper East Side. She absorbed the privileged background of a cultured and progressive Jewish intellectual family. Her father was Alfred Frankenthaler, a respected New York State Supreme Court judge. Judaism, however, had little effect on her art. She was married to famous artist Robert Motherwell for a while, a blending of 2 talented geniuses. Helen Frankenthaler poured washes of thin paint directly onto raw, unstretched canvas in watery washes, more like stain painting. The style is known as color field, with blurry shapes, elegant swatches of soft color. Her constant high achievement ranks her as one of the most important contributors to the history of post-war American painting. Roy Lichtenstein played down his roots and didn't speak often of being Jewish. His only work to directly address his Jewish roots is a 50-foot tall 2-panel mural he painted in 1989 and adapted for a fundraising print for the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. Cartoons, Ben-Day dots, lettering, and speech balloons became his trademark. Our sculpture, Goldfish Bowl, uses the same stylized lines and colors of comic book illustration that are a hallmark of his paintings. Sounds like a one-trick pony, but it lasted 4 years. Jim Dine's parents were second-generation immigrants from Eastern Europe and practicing Jews, an identity which influenced his artistic career. His Jewish identity played a central role in shaping his life, which he expressed in his book and autographical poem, Jewish Fate. His artwork has also touched on these themes, particularly his childhood memories of growing up in his grandfather's hardware store, where he gained a deep interest in the power of ordinary objects. His paintings contain real objects that have nothing to do with their intended use. So here he asks us to consider the innate beauty of everyday commonplace nostalgic objects, such as a mirrored medicine cabinet, a toothbrush holder, and a roll of yellow toilet paper. George Segal was an American pop artist, best known for his iconic figurative sculptures. Easily recognizable as completely white plaster casts of people in poses, and the setting is in poses mimic daily life. His sculpture kind of offers a haunting portrait of American life in the 20th century. This sculpture was created using Segal's unusual characteristic method of applying cotton bandages dipped in plaster onto the faces and bodies of his chosen models, usually family, friends, and neighbors. And once the plaster was hard, like a doctor removing a cast, Segal would saw through the plaster and remove it. He would then reattach the pieces. I really don't think I'd want to be one of his models. De Souvereau's massive sculptures lend themselves to the idea that they're like drawings in space. Often visually off balance and asymmetrical, Marco Polo de Souvereau's parents were both Italian Sephardic Jews. He was born in China. His father was an anti-fascist working at the Italian consulate. They eventually settled in San Francisco. He works with heavy construction beams. Just shortly before his first solo exhibition, de Souvereau suffered a nearly fatal elevator accident. His back was broken and his spinal injuries were severe, so much so that he was uncertain whether he would ever be able to walk again. After using a wheelchair for the next decade, he began walking with braces and crutches. A powerful wood and steel structure, 22 by 30 feet tall, is titled Praise for Elohim Adonai. De Souvereau names his sculpture after things he cares deeply about, drawing often from his Jewish studies. Morris Louis Bernstein was one of 4 sons born into a middle-class Jewish family in Baltimore, Maryland. Of course, he now calls himself Morris Louis. His parents were Russian immigrants. Unfurled remain his most readily identifiable and perhaps most important work. Ours is part of that series. They're named after Lewis's technique of pouring the paint and then soaking it into the cloth. As large as 20 feet in width, they are his most monumental paintings. Lewis did create a series that referenced his Jewish roots. The Charred Journal is a series of emblematic paintings that refer to burning of Jewish literature during World War II carried out by the Nazis. Philip Pearlstein. When asked about what, if anything, figure painter Philip Pearlstein considered Jewish about his realist art, he replied, nothing. Yet he did, however, paint some pictures with Jewish themes, such as Moses with the tablets of the law. But his figures are usually dispassionate, smooth, almost glossy, and appear In his pictures, alongside a clutter of knickknacks and brightly colored rugs, nothing is prioritized in Pearlstein's work. Every detail takes on the same significance, leaving the eye to kind of wander unguided across the canvas. Yet his paintings challenge the viewer. Some people and critics are really hostile. Some say his paintings are disagreeable and offensive. What do you think? Audrey Flack was an observant Jew and well-versed in her Jewish heritage and tradition. The daughter of Polish Jewish immigrants, Flack grew up in Washington Heights, New York, among Holocaust refugees and survivors. Not only did Flack introduce a whole new style of art, it was her Jewish art that helped her to stand out as she became one of the first artists to paint a Holocaust scene. But Flack is known for her hyperrealism. She achieved this photoreal effect by projecting, tracing, and recoloring real historical events, real objects, into oversized canvases. Susan Rothenberg's painting came to life through Rothenberg's thickly layered and nervous-looking brushstrokes. Her backgrounds are filled with action, as you see in Mondrian Dancing. Rothenberg married the artist Bruce Nauman in 1989, and the following year they moved from the city to a ranch in New Mexico, where they remained ever since. Bruce Nauman's parents were solid middle-class Westerners. Bruce was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Nauman, who is well over 6 feet, in his made-to-order cowboy boots, has the physical bearing of an old-time Western movie star. His primary medium is sculpture, but he used such a variety of materials and media, including film, video, drawings, prints, performance, sound, and neon light, that his works has no signature style. World Peace Received is an installation piece made over 30 years into Nauman's career and considers the possibilities and limits of communication. 5 video monitors are placed around a stool, inviting visitors to the gallery to sit, to listen, and to watch the monitors, each of which features a different speaker. The piece asks, how do we sound to each other? Who is speaking? Is anyone listening? It's a really interesting sculpture. Lucian Freud. His portraits are often called discomforting, and I think that's mild. On one of my tours, a woman briskly walked out of the gallery complaining that these portraits made her uncomfortable, or at least angry. Some have labeled his work grotesque realism. They're not easy to look at. Freud did not explore Jewish issues or history. His figures show little ethnic identity. If anything, his pictures just seem edgy. He was a very strange man. Devious, shifty, and compulsively secretive, he moved from address to address to address and never registered to vote so as not to leave a public trace of his whereabouts. Freud's snobbery toward the middle-class Jews of North London manifested itself in outrageously anti-Semitic outbursts in restaurants, and he considered any sort of birth control squalid. As a consequence of his taking hundreds of lovers, he fathered 13 or 14 acknowledged children, as well as dozens of bastards, and he neglected and abandoned all of them. Throughout his life, he seemed to have had a constitutional immunity to shame or guilt or responsibility. And finally, these last 2 artists. William Kentridge. Kentridge's wealthy Jewish parents were both anti-apartheid lawyers and civil rights activists in South Africa. His father achieved international status after defending Nelson Mandela in the treason trials in 1956 to 61. Upon first glance, sheets of evidence appear to be a book of empty white pages, and when you interact with it, you discover the subtle but striking images and text about love, sexuality, human relations, and death. Turning the pages make the images appear and disappear into the sheet, giving them a life beyond the page. Sheets of evidence is doubtless among his simplest work, but it is worth reviewing carefully. Now let's look finally at this glasswork of Tuszynski. I agree with a critic who said, in an age in which the relevance of beauty to art is widely questioned, Zinsky's work is uncompromisingly beautiful. It's the one piece of decorative arts that I would love to take home. It is really stunning. Marianne Zinsky was born and raised in a Jewish home in Massachusetts and was known as Toots from almost the time she was born. Her work developed under Dale Chihuly, who made studio glass a worldwide phenomenon. Zinsky's distinctive heat-formed glass thread vessels enjoy a popular, widespread acclaim. They are not only gorgeous, but elegant and graceful and refined. A beautiful piece to end our tour. So let me conclude with this question. After talking about the dozens of Jewish artists in SLAM, what then is our takeaway? Truly, these artists and styles are diverse, to say the least, as are their biographies. The upshot is that while Jews produce art, they don't always produce Jewish art. No sole definition of Jewish art has universal applicability. Each artist has a unique style and distinct reaction to Judaism. I think we can agree that the role of Judaism in the lives of these artists gathered here is a mixed bag. So after 4 hours, as we've seen, art and Judaism is a difficult tale to tell. The Jewishness of Jewish art is complicated, but is compelling in, I think, many ways, addictive. From Judaica to Bible stories to Jewish subjects, from art related to Jewish history to Jewish donors and Jewish artists, we've seen how complicated a topic Jewish art is. There is no unifying theory of Jewish art, but we've seen that Jewish art can speak Jewish in many different contexts. I'm so glad you were able to join us on this journey. I hope we were able to fill in the picture of Jews, Judaism, and Jewishness as we looked at this spectacular art in the St. Louis Art Museum. And I hope we'll see you in the gallery soon, where you can visit these pieces in person. Thank you again to the Mirowitz Center and the Jewish Light for co-sponsoring the series, and I truly appreciate their collaboration and support in bringing this program to all of you. The next series will focus on women in art in the St. Louis Art Museum, and I certainly hope you can join us. So until next time, stay safe and well, and thanks again for joining us. So are there any questions or comments that we can take?
For one thing, I thank you from all of us for the time and the information that you share and the way in which you share it. Thank you again for your time and dedication to the subject and to the museum and to all of us.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dale. I loved it.
Oh, thanks, Marcia.
Really, it was just so interesting. I can't wait to your next one.
Great. Thank you.
Keep me in the loop.
Well, that's up to Judy.
Okay.
We will definitely keep you all in the loop for the upcoming program, which is going to be another exciting program. I want to let you know there was a few comments as well in the chat. Michelle Gralnick said, years ago, my father Herbert was interviewed by several local news outlets regarding Sarah's outdoor installation here in St. Louis, discussing its merits as real art. I also recall Aaron Mermelstein doing some comedic segments on Channel 5 involving downtown installation on April Fool's Day. So that's a comment. And next time anyone, Marcia says, next time anyone is in Houston, Texas, visit the Rothko Chapel, and it's amazing.
Right. It's just it's incredible that it's a circle, if I remember, kind of with his paintings all through it. And they're, I think they're black, aren't they? Aren't they? If my memory serves right. Is that correct?
Let's see, is Marcia still on?
Yeah, I'm
Marcia.
still on.
Okay. Do you know?
No,
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think
Oh, okay.
they're dark paintings, and but it's really emotional. It's wonderful.
Yes,
Many,
the paintings are black, gray, but they're very, very dark, and you have to stare at them a very, very long time. But
Rothko is just, you have to take, if you spend the time
yes,
looking at a Rothko painting, it's going to get you.
yes,
It really will. I mean, one time I was I'm going to confess this. I was in a gallery in I think it was at LACMA, and I was standing in front of I was in the gallery by myself and looking at a Rothko painting, and I just all of a sudden the tears started coming down my face, and I don't know why. I don't know. I could never explain it, but it really did. The power of that painting really affected me, and that's what he wanted. That was his goal. And I think when you're in a room like in this Houston chapel, you can really feel it. It's almost overwhelming.
I think that may be all the questions. There's many, many wonderful comments, Dale, that I will send to you in an email that people have shared. Thank you. This was an amazing, amazing program, and we look forward to your next program, Women in Art.
Okay.
Anyone else have another question before we close for today?
Yeah.
Dale, just a comment. If you ever get to Bilbao, the Guggenheim Museum, Sarah has a fabulous museum of pieces of art that you could observe from the second balcony. It's all
Oh,
curved steel.
Ah,
It
okay.
is fabulous.
It's great. Well, we have a few here, at the Pulitzer Museum. Joe is just an incredible. Have you all been there?
Yes. Yes.
The kind of spiral. I mean, that's just amazing.
Yeah,
Sarah's
these are all spiral pieces, and you have to stand in the second floor balcony and look down, and they all converge in some of them. So, and then you have the ability to walk through them and go through all the curved structures.
That's terrific. I mean, that would be getting it from that angle would
Yeah.
give you a different feeling for
It's
it.
amazing. And thank you for all your presentations. They're fabulous.
Absolutely.
thanks,
They're
Anne.
just fabulous too. Just
Thanks, you guys.
fabulous.
I'm glad you all joined us. It was, obviously it's my love, so my passion. So I'm glad I could share it. So
And it shows through each sentence. It's just wonderful. Thanks again.
oh, thanks, Joy.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Okay.
honey.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much,
Bye,
Dale.
everybody.
We love it. We can't wait to see you again. And everyone have a nice day and a nice week, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.